All right, welcome, my fellow learned listeners. It's episode 2 of the Blithedale Romance series seminar on the Godward podcast. I'm your host, Casey, joking about learned. I guess I'm pronouncing it the wrong way. Those are always my favorite comments from listeners, by the way. You're pronouncing this the wrong way. Really keep those coming. I want you to picture the year 1845, and this is 7 years before Hawthorne published the Blithedale Romance. I got it wrong last time, by the way. I think I said 1854. 1852 was the date of publication. So you're picturing 1845, when the telegraph was invented. And listen to this description from an article that published that year in a journal called Harbinger. Not sure how to pronounce it. Quote, "It is now almost certain that within a few months the magnetic telegraph, which is literally thought and flies as swift, absolutely annihilating space and running in advance of time, will extend to all the great cities in the Union, so that a network of nerves of iron wire strung lightning will ramify from the brain New York to the distant limbs and members, to the Atlantic seaboard towns, to Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Louisville, Nashville, St. Louis, and New Orleans, and that every commercial, political, or social event transpiring at either of these points will be, at the very instant it happens, in all." From an article called Magnetic Telegraph, 26th of July, 1845. Now, coupled with the promises of, railroads, which were new at the time, this was nothing less than the internet in terms of how it changed social relations and what it meant for organizing society. At the same time, as I said in the last episode, there were all sorts of political revolutions underway in Europe and religious revivals in America. There were herbalists and snake oil salesmen and gamblers up and down the Mississippi, and there were reform movements of all sorts. Reform was the word of the decade. Women's rights, penal reform, anti-slavery, the temperance movement. Meanwhile, industrialization was changing the way cities were organizing. Phrenology was ascendant. Bizarre dietary movements were faddish. Just listen to this paragraph from former Duke professor turned Duke University president, who famously or infamously leapt to conclusions about the Duke lacrosse team. His name was Richard Broadhead. And here he speaks of Hawthorne's veiled lady, I mentioned this in the last episode, as a type of the popular crystal ball reading, palmistry practicing, witchy woman that experienced a renaissance in the 1840s. Broadhead says, quote, "More generally, the veiled lady images, as a salience of contemporary life, the cultural attraction of what Blithedale calls new sciences, that congeries of systems, Swedenborgianism, phrenology, utopian socialism, and Grammite dietary lore are other examples, that developed into something between fad philosophies and surrogate religions in the American 1840s. Grouped as she is with Hollingsworth, Zenobia, and the Blithedalers, Priscilla shows such new sciences as literally living together with many other social movements of comparably recent birth. Penal reform, the women's rights movement, communitarianism, and so on. In this sense, this exhibit of the new truths of mesmerism appear as one manifestation of the variously directed energy of social and intellectual reconstructions that touched almost all aspects of American culture in the 1840s, known by the generic label reform." I know this is sort of egg-headed rhetoric from, an academic book, but I hope you can hear through to the substance. The point is, the 1840s undertook a whole woke program. New values, new science, escaped slaves like Frederick Douglass giving public speeches in New England about slavery. And you had Emerson lecturing about the oversoul, and so on. Let me also add that by 1854, so 9 years later, the Know-Nothing Party swept the Massachusetts election and made waves nationwide. Yes, the backlash was active too. I've read a sermon from this time period that was an anti-dancing sermon published in Ohio. It goes through all 17 mentions of dancing in the Bible and explicates how dancing was strictly forbidden unless it was to worship God. So the progressive push was active, but the reactionary and traditionalist refusal was not yet gone in 1854. And then, of course, 1861, just 7 years after that. So I hope this feels kind of relevant to you. It does to me, at least as far as like the setting and the backdrop for, the kind of thinking that Hawthorne is doing. So, okay, let's get to our 1852 novel, The Blithedale Romance. Again, this is part 2. You have to have watched part 1 recently to appreciate what I'm doing here. But, I was thinking last night that if I really read this book closely another 2 or 3 times, I could almost do an amazing thing, which would be simply to become Miles Coverdale, the narrator, and just tell the story myself as if it were my own story. The amazing thing is, it would be a 200-page long story, and it would be a good one. That's kind of the point. That's what this novel is. And maybe I could even just, update the setting so that, instead of it being, 1844 in Massachusetts at, Brook Farm, it could be about a time that I went to live at a utopian camp outside, a property in southern Indiana with a bunch of grad school dropouts or something. And instead of the veiled lady, I probably would be talking about some yoga girl who did Reiki healing or something. You understand? All of these things just kind of transfer into the present year. What Hawthorne is doing here is not so much about the 1850s as it is about eternal things, eternal types, in human nature, and about what happens when you mix together these eternal types. So last time we made it through about 5 chapters. The 4 main characters made it to the farm, right? We had Coverdale, Miles Coverdale, the incel narrator. You had Hollingsworth, the alpha with a prison reform plan that he's increasingly obsessed with. And then there's Zenobia, the literary elitist, slumming as a hippie for the summer. And Priscilla, this mysterious, waifish, pale 17-year-old who shows up looking kind of hollowed out and wasted, but soon recovers her health and gains a rosy glow on the cheek as the people at the farm kind of take her in. So that's about the first 5 chapters. Now, chapter 6 begins with Coverdale. And by the way, again, to remind you, what I'm trying to do here is almost to just tell you in 4 YouTube videos everything you need to know so that you don't even have to read this book. And I'm not sure whether this is possible or not, or whether it's it feels to me a little bit like a violation. If I am thinking, would the ghost of Hawthorne be pleased with me? And there's a part of me that's probably not, actually. Because part of what he does is he sets up this thing where he's I'm not even trying to reach everyone. This is for the few who are willing to try with me to understand, So maybe I'm spoon-feeding you a little too much. I don't know. But anyway. So chapter 6 begins with Coverdale still recovering from his illness. And he mentions that Hollingsworth was one of the only people at the farm to begin his day with a prayer. There's a point where Coverdale overhears Hollingsworth praying at the beginning of the day. And Coverdale remarks, he says, "It is so rare in these times to meet with a man of prayerful habits, that such a one is decidedly marked out by a light of transfiguration, shed upon him in the divine interview from which he passes into his daily life." End quote. And to me, this is just sort of interesting as an indicator of life in 1845. Not necessarily that it describes your average New Englander, who probably was a church attender and probably did pray daily, but among the intellectual class, belief in the Christian God was already sort of passé long before Nietzsche. Coverdale gives us further insight into the period, describing the reading he did while he was in his recovery from his illness in bed. He mentions Emerson, he mentions Carlyle, he mentions the literary magazine known as The Dial, which is an interesting read on the Wikipedia page, George Sand's romances, Swedenborg, and Fourier. The point is, these are the Deleuze and Derrida and David Foster Wallace of their day. You understand? Again, I'm just cranking it into 2021 for you so you understand sort of who this is. These are the movers and shakers of the kind of nonconformist intellectual world And yeah, you can picture Justin Murphy and his associates, if you want, going to try to do, to build the farm outside of Austin or whatever and start civilization better. And the things that they're reading and the kinds of things they're discussing are basically, the hip stuff from the day, which was Emerson and Carlyle and all that stuff. Hollingsworth and Coverdale joke together about the famous line in Fourier where he says the oceans will be transformed into lemonade as part of the culmination of his system. I think that's an interesting thing to mention just because it gives you a sense that, like, even though, like, I mean, I guess it would be like making fun of Deleuze or something, right? Or making fun of Foucault, like, which it suggests a very contemporary perspective, right? Like that you've kind of gone even further than the last generation's big intellectuals. I guess that's the idea. Coverdale's observations about the community in general are insightful, especially given his more cynical perspective, I think. I mentioned last time, he's narrating from like after the fact. So after it all falls apart, basically, he has some insights and he's more cynical because of that. And one of the things he says, here's a couple of sentences, I think is like helpful, actually relevant in thinking about like Benedict option style, minoritarian experiments in living that you might undertake in 2021. Sorry about the allergies here. He says, quote, hold on, I'm going to sneeze. All right, he says, quote, in the internal of my seclusion, there had been a number of recruits to our little army of saints and martyrs. They were mostly individuals who had gone through such an experience as to disgust them with ordinary pursuits, but who were not yet so old, nor had suffered so deeply, as to lose their faith in the better time to come. On the whole, it was a society such as has seldom met together, nor perhaps could it reasonably be expected to hold together long. Persons of marked individuality, crooked sticks, as some of us might be called, are not exactly the easiest to bind up into a faggot. And yes, this is a crucial point, right? Everybody at Blithedale felt superior to the normies, and that's why they left normie life, you understand? But when you get all these nonconformists together, don't expect that binding them together will be a simple project. It's not easy, right? Coverdale explains, he says, our bond, it seems to me, was not affirmative, but negative. We had individually found one thing or another to quarrel with in our past life, and were pretty well agreed as to the inexpediency of lumbering along within the old system any farther. But as to what should be substituted, there was much less unanimity. I mean, here's some wisdom, listeners. And frankly, it does remind me a lot of the people I like to listen to and talk with on YouTube. We know, actually yesterday someone tweeted a video of that Osho guy, with the beard. I loved him 5 years ago. Like Osho, he's kind of vaguely Hindu, Buddhist guru guy, and then they moved to like Oregon. Maybe you saw that Netflix special to start a commune. And he's great. Like he is a great orator, a great talker. I love him. And someone said, I think it was VDR said, like, are you planning to move to the commune and start over? And it's like, no, I'm actually not, because it won't work, as it never does. But I'm always interested in the commune starters, The point is, like, as I said, it does remind me of a lot of the people I listen to on YouTube. We all know that empire ain't the thing for us, right? But whether it will be a Catholic imperium that replaces it, or an anarcho-syndicalist, commune, or whatever else, we never quite managed to settle, right? All right, chapter 9 is titled Hollingsworth, Zenobia, Priscilla. And in this chapter, Coverdale says that these three were separated from the rest of the community, to his imagination, and stood forth as the indices of a problem which it was my business to solve. So the next few chapters begin like this even slower inspection of the character of these three personages. And now Coverdale is hinting for the reason he's basically saying, he's hinting at his own reason for kind of obsessively it's like that meme with the guy standing in the corner while the rest of them are dancing at the party. They don't even know that I'm the narrator. right? Like that's the meme here. And so his interest is like what is going to happen in this love triangle with Hollingsworth and Zenobia and Priscilla. So here he begins with Hollingsworth, and he says Hollingsworth was not altogether human. Now, what makes him say that? What makes him less than human? Coverdale's explanation is right on the money, and I know most of you will recognize this type. Okay, he says, quote, "This is always true of those men who have surrendered themselves to an overruling purpose. It does not so much impel them from without, nor even operate as a motive power from within, but grows incorporate with all that they think and feel, and finally converts them into little else save that one principle. When such begins to be the predicament, it is not cowardice, but wisdom to avoid these victims. They have no heart, no sympathy, no reason, no conscience. They will keep no friend unless he make himself the mirror of their purpose. They will smite and slay you and trample your dead corpse underfoot, all the more readily if you take the first step with them and cannot take the second and third and every step of their terribly straight path." Man, I hope you guys get it. This guy, I love that description. I hope you understand that character type. These people were all over the place in grad school, by the way. Everybody like picked their favorite author, you know. They're like, I'm into Derrida, and then it was like that was all they would talk about. You know what I mean? And like they'll be your friend as long as you're listening to their oration on Derrida, but if not, they kind of have no use for you. I mean, who is this guy? Whatever. It's the guy who has it all figured out. He has a system, and basically the system slowly replaces his personality, right? He's like, as I said, he's friendly enough as long as you agree with him, but as soon as you tap out, he'll have nothing but scorn for you. And I think this is a great insight from Hawthorne. And then another thing I absolutely like revere in Hawthorne, his very next paragraph in the book, right after this one where he kind of slams Hollingsworth as being a monomaniac, the very next paragraph is Coverdale still speaking, still narrating. I mean, but it's Hawthorne. And he says something that is so sophisticated here. He says, quote, "Of course, I am perfectly aware that the above statement is exaggerated in the attempt to make it adequate. Professed philanthropists have gone far, but no originally good man, I presume, ever went quite so far as this. Let the reader abate whatever he deems fit. The paragraph may remain, however, both for its truth and its exaggeration, as strongly expressive of the tendencies which were really operative in Hollingsworth, and as exemplifying the kind of error into which my mode of observation was calculated to lead me." Isn't that amazing? Like, he sort of gives you this over-the-top description of Hollingsworth that's like, it's like a comic book level monomaniac villain, right? To make the point. But then he in the very next paragraph, he's so self-conscious, he's so human, that he goes, look, I get it. You know, in real life, it's never quite so black and white. But there is a tendency in that direction, you know? And man, isn't that so true? I think that's exactly true. That's exactly what real life is like. It's like even these guys who are obsessed with their system, they're never quite Captain Ahab. You know what I mean? It's like there's a reality somewhere in between there. Now, around this point, Coverdale mentions the free love ideology of the commune. He says, quote, "It seemed to authorize any individual of either sex to fall in love with any other, regardless of what would elsewhere be judged suitable and prudent." And then he hints that the jostling of Priscilla and Zenobia against a man like Hollingsworth, that is, first of all, one of these charismatic alpha men, but also one of these monomaniacal obsessive types, that this mix was likely to be no child's play. And so by this point, we're expecting fireworks in the love triangle. Okay, chapter 10 is called, are you with me? Okay, chapter 10 is called A Visitor from Town. And it's this old guy, Mr. Moody, who we briefly saw in chapter 1 back in Boston. And he sort of starts stumbling towards the farm. They kind of see him from a distance. He seems to be the kind of guy who's like, he avoids eye contact. He's pretty dodgy, this old guy, Mr. Moody. In fact, one of his eyes is behind a patch. Coverdale and Hollingsworth are out on a hill hoeing potatoes when he approaches. Coverdale recognizes him from the village, and in a very roundabout way, rather mysteriously, the old forlorn man inquires about Priscilla and Zenobia. This all seems very uncanny to readers, at least. Because remember from that last episode I did when I said Priscilla, when she first showed up that night of the snowstorm, she comes in and she begs specifically to stay near Zenobia. And it's very odd. It's very what's going on here? So this Mr. Moody then shows up and he asks if Zenobia is kind to my poor Priscilla. And it's what's going on, right? Hollingsworth says, yes, she is. Moody says, or asks, like a gentlewoman and her maidservant, I fancy. And Hollingsworth says, like an elder and younger sister, rather. And this seems to please Moody. And so he starts to kind of sneak away toward the farm where he's going to observe the two girls. And he sees them walking arm in arm at first, and he seems to be pleased. But then there's this moment he's hiding behind a tree. They don't see him. And he sees Zenobia sort of haughtily, put Priscilla away, basically. Say, enough, Priscilla, get away. And at that point, Moody slinks away, unobserved by the girls. And he's shaking his head the whole way, and he looks back, and he even shakes a fist as he's walking out of the scene. Now we, the readers, know nothing about this. And I mean, what the heck is going on? You don't understand why this is happening. What does this guy care about Priscilla? What does he care about Zenobia caring about Priscilla? It's very weird, okay? And then the next chapter gets even weirder. In the next chapter, Coverdale decides he needs a half day's vacation, basically. He's an introvert, even though he's doing this experiment with the people on the farm. And so he's walking out into the woods. He's just getting into the transcendent mood. And then he comes across this, or actually he's accosted by this very dapper stranger, Professor Westervelt, he's going to call himself. And this guy has the whole outfit, the gold chain, the crispest, whitest shirt you ever saw. He's like a real mountebank, a real charlatan at first glimpse, and he's very annoying. He starts calling Coverdale friend right away, and he's pestering him with questions. And Coverdale's trying to go on his nature walk, and he won't leave him alone and stuff. And then Professor Westervelt asks about Zenobia and Priscilla. In fact, he says, can you do me a favor, friend? He says, I want to meet with them, but not on the farm. Rather privately, I want to meet with them. At this point, Coverdale's what the hell is going on here? Basically, no, you're going to have to go ask them yourself, although he does tell Westervelt where Zenobia likes to hang out alone. And so, I mean, because it's not worried about her getting raped or anything. He says she'll be fine. It's within community there. But he makes it possible for Westervelt to get in touch with Zenobia. Eventually, he tells the guy to scram, and he continues his nature walk. So Coverdale escapes from Westervelt, and Westervelt takes off in the direction of the farm. Now, and by the way, I'm continuing this story, and I'm thinking, this is impossible, isn't it? You can't tell such an interesting, good story to people because you'll lose their attention. I mean, basically, even if I told it to you as my own story, it's too long of a story. You kind of have to picture yourself with me in an Irish pub all day, and I'm just going to tell you this crazy thing that happened, So, okay, well, anyway. Then, in the next chapter, Coverdale, out on his nature walk, he finds this little grove of trees that he climbs up into. And the trees, there's about 3 or 4 trees, it says, knotted together. And they're surrounded by a vine, a very thick growing vine. And so he can kind of climb up into them. It's like a treehouse, like a little Winnie the Pooh sort of treehouse thing up there. A little natural thing. And he's going to, take half the day off, write some poetry, and relax. From there, he can see the farm, he can see the river. And soon enough, he hears voices approaching. He's perfectly placed and perfectly disguised to play the voyeur, and so he just listens. Turns out it's Zenobia and this Westervelt guy. I mean, what the heck, right? So at first, he can't hear them, but he can see them a little bit, and he judges by their body language and so on that there is a kind of familiarity between them that must indicate that they had known each other before today. Like, he says, but it seemed now this familiarity to have prolonged itself into as intimate a hatred for all futurity. So there's some past between these two, basically. When he does catch a few of the words they're saying, it makes little sense. This is perfect Hawthorne here, just giving you, just a glimpse, something to hint at what's going on. All he catches is something about, quote, flinging the girl off, letting her go, says Westervelt. And then Zenobia replying something about, the poor child, she can do me no good nor harm. And then some heavy sighing and something about a burden and, fate. So that's it. They're clearly talking about Priscilla, but you have no idea really why or what the heck interest Westervelt could have in Priscilla, and the mystery intensifies. And then chapter 13, which I really love, it's near the center of the book, and the chapter is called Zenobias Legend. Now the premise of the chapter is that once a week or so, the people of Blithedale got together in the open field at the end of the workday to perform some dramatic recitations from Shakespeare, or excerpts from classical tragedy, or to display some scene from famous paintings or whatever. Very fun, very artsy. Zenobia seems to be kind of the curator of the whole thing, and she has on the stage with her a chest of costumes and scraps of material that she uses to dress for the parts of various roles she's playing. She's almost finished for the evening when the younger girls of the farm beg her to tell a story. A ghost story, they say, and she finally agrees and says, it's not a ghost story exactly. Now, the story is called The Silvery Veil, and it is about the veiled lady. I want you to get this straight in your head, right? So in the novel, in town, there is this veiled lady. I mentioned this last time. To remind you, the veiled lady was this like freak show, sort of carnival act in the town, something like a mesmerist or a crystal ball reader. A woman, presumably, whose face was neither revealed, or was never revealed, because it was always concealed behind this luxurious, silky white veil that fell down to her feet. Now, Coverdale says he's going to do his best to present the whole story that Zenobia told that night on the stage to us, just as he heard it there at Blithedale Farm. And now I'm going to tell you the story that Coverdale heard Zenobia tell the people, okay? But he also says that the story was undeniable nonsense. But I will say, as a reader, when you read it, it feels like more than nonsense. It feels actually like the thing in Hamlet, where they set up that play, the play's the thing wherein we'll catch the conscience of the king. Something like that. This is the play within a play here. So, okay, the way Zenobia tells the story, she's on stage, and by the way, she specifically commands Priscilla to sit front and center and says, I will take inspiration from your eyes, Priscilla. So the story is that one day back in town, a trio of guys were standing around drinking wine and talking, and the subject of the veiled lady came up as they were gossiping about other young ladies. And two of the guys said some nonsense, she was the daughter of a prestigious family, or she was a ghost, or whatever. And then the third guy says, he's drunk, they're all kind of drunk, says, enough, I will find out today her true identity. And so they put up a bet here. They've all been drinking wine. He's feeling brave, I imagine, whatever. So this third guy, Zenobia says, I'm going to call him Theodore. He sneaks backstage that night while the veiled lady is doing her performance and waits for the show to end so that he can surprise her as she comes backstage and somehow get a glimpse of her face. Well, basically his plan works. He's back there with her. As soon as she's off stage, he's hiding behind a curtain. The wine is wearing off, so now he's, on the cusp of panicking, hiding behind this curtain, when, for no good reason, she says all of a sudden, and it kind of shocks you as the reader or listener, she says, come forth, Theodore. And here it's like, what the fuck? Like, is she a real magician? How is this happening? Remember, this is Zenobia's story, right? Okay. The veiled lady asks Theodore, what do you want? And he says, I would know who and what you are. She says her lips are forbidden to betray the secret. He says he must know. It does start to feel a little like threatening or rapey or something there. And then she says, there is no way save to lift my veil. I will say, as you're reading it in Hawthorne, to me, because I've read all the Hawthorne, it feels like it has symbolic significance. In fact, I feel like there is some ancient Greek myth about a statue that was underneath a veil, and whoever peeked at it turned to stone or something like that. It's one of these things, and it gives you that feeling of being maybe it's about I don't know, the truth or God or something like that, But anyway, as he's about to do it, he's about to lift the veil, she says, wait, there are conditions, okay? And the conditions are, basically there are 3 ways this is going to happen. The first is you're going to see nothing. You're not even going to think of me again. You're just going to walk away, basically, okay? Or you can lift this mysterious veil, but, she says, and this mysterious veil, she says, beneath which I am a sad and lonely prisoner, in a bondage which is worse to me than death. Okay, but before raising it, you have to kiss my virgin lips. If you do this, basically we get married, and I'm yours and you're mine forever. Okay? So he has to kiss her before he sees her face. Then she says there is still another way, a third way. Don't kiss me, but lift the veil. But if you do this, she says, I am doomed to be thy evil fate, nor wilt thou ever taste another breath of happiness. So this is super weird, obviously. But anyway, he doesn't want to kiss her without seeing her, Zenobia says. Too risky. So he lifts the veil without kissing her, choosing that third option. And this is what Zenobia says. Grasping at the veil, he flung it upward and caught a glimpse of a pale, lovely face beneath. Just one momentary glimpse, and then the apparition vanished, and the silvery veil fluttered slowly down and lay upon the floor. So what? This is a complete, now we're in complete magic land, right? Zenobia is telling the story, remember, for the little girls at camp or whatever. But what happened is the veiled lady literally vanished, poof, like a witch or something. So I don't know, it's pretty crazy, pretty far out. Now, the story's not over. Now Zenobia continues her story. She says, well, what happened? Did she vanish? She says, just at the moment when the veiled lady vanished, a maiden, pale and shadowy, rose up amid a knot of visionary people who were seeking for the better life. Obviously referring to now Blithedale, and it's going to be Priscilla, pretty obviously, right? Among them, she says, among them was a lady, to whom more than all the rest, this pale, mysterious girl attached herself. So, I hope you're catching the meta layers here. The lady is Zenobia, right? So now she's describing herself being sort of, she's describing Priscilla attaching herself to herself, but she's doing it in the form of this story that supposedly happened, and it's a very magical story. I know I'm not doing this justice, but reading it, I'm telling you, if you read it, it's obvious that Zenobia is sort of retelling Priscilla's story. And so she's hinting, in front of everyone, that Priscilla was the veiled lady who did indeed stop making public appearances around the time Priscilla showed up at the farm. Then Zenobia's story continues. She says, one morning, the lady was wandering in the woods, and there met a figure in an oriental robe with a dark beard, and holding in his hand a silvery veil. Lady, he said, you are in peril. There is a certain maiden who has come out of the realm of mystery and made herself your most intimate companion. Now the fates have so ordained it that whether by her own will or no, this stranger is your deadliest enemy. Remember, Priscilla is sitting in the front row as Zenobia is saying all this. And of course, Coverdale saw Zenobia meet in the woods with basically an Oriental gentleman and heard them talking about Priscilla. So it's like, what is going on here? At this point, Zenobia says that the lady in her story, who is like herself, right, asks how she can escape the disaster. And the Oriental man, the Mr. Westervelt version in the story, says, "Take this veil. It is a spell. It is a powerful enchantment. Throw it, unawares, over the head of this secret foe. Stamp your foot and cry, 'Arise, magician, here is the veiled lady.' And immediately I will rise up through the earth and seize her." And right then, as she's telling the story on stage, with everybody listening and Priscilla sitting in the front row, Zenobia throws the veil she's been holding for the whole story over Priscilla. Now, of course, nothing happens. No magician manifests to take Priscilla. No disappearing act, nothing. It's just that's the end of her story. And so like everybody in the crowd is like, like what is happening here? And finally they look under the veil and Priscilla's on there, and Priscilla has turned ghostly pale again. And he's basically like shaking. And so like at this point, I don't know what to say. Like at this point, it's just a story, right? It's just a story. Like that's what Zenobia would say as she sort of comes off stage and everybody goes, "What was that?" Nothing. Just a story. But like everyone knows that the story is not just a story. This story is about us, Priscilla, Zenobia, the veiled lady, some man you're meeting in the forest. Like it's all so crazy interwoven and like and mysterious at this point. This is about halfway into the book, and that was a hard 7 chapters to summarize for you. If you managed to bear with me at this point, the rest of it should come easier. I'm not really going to introduce very many new characters or anything like that. We're just going to sort of see the resolution. I'll read the rest of the book in the next day or two and see if I can fit it all into one episode or not. But that's all. Thanks for listening. Hope you're enjoying it. Talk to you next time on The Godward Show.